Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third place playoff in the International Reparations Debate Competition for 2026. I am Jermaine Barrett, and I'll be your chair adjudicator for this match. I'm delighted to make welcome at this time to introduce themselves our wing adjudicators, beginning with Roshana Jarrett.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roshana Jarrett, and it is my pleasure to serve as one of your wing adjudicators this morning. I hope to see an exciting match, good exchange of ideas, and may the better team win.
Thank you very much, Roshana. And over to our third and other wing adjudicator, Jordana Denton, rather.
Hi everyone. So again, my name is Jordana Denson. Like Roshan, I'm also excited to be here and look forward to the class of ideas. All the best to both teams.
Thank you very much, Jordana. And listeners, viewers, we are delighted to have with us a group of spectacular entities who have come on board to sponsor, to partner with us for this amazing competition. I know, yield the floor to Roshana to have her introduce our partners and sponsors.
Our sponsors for this competition 2026 are the University of the West Indies, the Center for Reparation Research, UA Press, Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment J Limited, University of Hull, and our main partners, the Repair Campaign.
Thank you so very much, Roshana. And of course, viewers, everyone, we are here because of two Titanic teams who have gotten thus far. We have, for this match, inside proposition, we have the Montego Bay High School for Girls. They are from Jamaica, and they're going up against the opposition team, Rawlins Academy, out of the United Kingdom. At this time, I make welcome to introduce themselves the proposition team, Montego Bay High School for Girls.
Good morning. My name is Shantae Lawrence, and I will be the first speaker representing Proposition today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Renee Paul, and I am the second opposition speaker. Proposition speaker.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Khadija Jennings, and I will be the third speaker for the proposition today.
All right, thank you very much, Montego Bay High School for Girls. And we now turn over to the opposition team, Rawlins Academy, to have them introduce themselves.
Hello everyone, I'm Aisha Basari and I am the first speaker for the opposition.
Good day, I'm Clara Byford and I'm the second speaker for the opposition.
Good day, I'm Edith Marshall and I'm the third speaker for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Rawlins Academy. All right, so we've met our teams, we've met our adjudicators, we've been reintroduced to our partners and sponsors. It is now time for us to go through the rules. Ladies and gentlemen, this format of debate is called the Jade Parliamentary Debate format, in which we have three debaters on each team. You'd have just met those debaters. The first speaker on each team will speak for 7 minutes. The second speaker speaks for 6 minutes. And the third and final speaker speaks for 5 minutes. After the first two speakers, as first proposition and first opposition speaker, we will have the first period of cross-examination. We'll have another period of cross-examination after the second pair of speakers, followed by a 1 minute pause. Then we will have the reply speakers, beginning with the reply speaker, or the third speaker from Rawlins Academy. That's the opposition team. And then the debate will conclude with the proposition's reply speaker from Montego Bay High School for Girls. When we get to the segment where we move into the cross-examination, I'll spend a little time to explain the rules specific to that segment or those segments. And of course, debaters are reminded that they have what are called protected times. So Jordana Denton, we're going to ask her to double up to be our official timekeeper. And she'll do that by providing an indication in the chat, the Zoom chat, indicating when you've spoken for 1 minute and when you have 1 minute to go. In between those first two time signals, points of information are allowed. In fact, they are very much welcomed. All right, now, having gone through the rules, it's now time for us to be introduced to our motion. So, Roshana, what is the motion that guides this debate?
All right, so the motion for this morning's match is this House believes that the influence of colonialism on culture is best understood as erasure rather than transformation. And I'll repeat that. This House believes that the influence of colonialism on culture is best understood as erasure rather than transformation.
All right, so we're at that point in time in our debate where we get the debaters doing their thing, really. And so we're now welcoming the first speaker from the proposition team, the Prime Minister from Montego Bay High School for Girls, to open this debate. Hear, hear.
For timekeeping purposes, I will begin my time in 3, 2, 1. My grandmother once tried to teach me a word. It was the name of a river in the parish in which her mother was born, a river that no longer exists on any map. She remembers the sound of it, the way it rolled off her own grandmother's tongue. And yet when she spoke it to me, she hesitated. I think this is right, but I cannot be sure. Mr. Speaker, that word is now dead. It is not sleeping, it has not been transformed, and it is most definitely not waiting to be revived. The word is dead. And here's an even more chilling truth. My grandmother is still alive. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before us today asks whether colonialism influence on culture is best understood as erasure or transformation. Let me be clear from this bench. Transformation implies survival. Erasure implies death, complete elimination. And what the colonial project did to the Caribbean was not reconstructive surgery. It was a targeted, systematic, and often genocidal campaign to ensure that certain cultures would not merely be altered, but that they would cease to exist entirely. You cannot transform a language once its last fluent speaker dies of a broken heart in a residential school. You cannot transform a kinship system once the children have been stolen and taught to despise their own reflection. You cannot transform what has been lost. Today, I will prove that the net outcome of colonial rule in the Caribbean was erasure, and I will do so using two devastating points. Firstly, the death of language, then the stolen generation and loss of identity. My second speaker will then touch on the renaming of geography and the change in the education system. And then my third and final speaker will summarize this debate and prove that we have won today's argument. Honorable adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, and my fellow opponents, a pleasant morning to you all. Before we proceed, let us clarify the motion. Transformation implies a process where an existing entity is altered, modified, or changed into something new while retaining a fundamental core or link to its origin. Erasure implies a process of removal, obliteration, or extinction. It ends. What replaces it is not a changed version of the original, it is a different entity entirely. Now let us begin with language. Why? Because language is not merely a tool for communication, it is the vessel of worldview. It contains a people's classification of nature, their laws of kinship, their poetry, their prayers, their jokes, their lullabies. And when a language dies, a unique way of understanding the universe dies with it. Now, if colonialism had transferred the Caribbean language, we would expect to see a continuum. We would expect to find indigenous languages absorbing European vocabulary, shifting grammar, but living beings pass from parent to child, evolving naturally. That is not what happened. That's not what we see. Before the arrival of Europeans, the island of Trinidad alone had at least 11 indigenous languages. 11! 5 belong to the Caribbean family, 3 belong to the Arawakan family, and 3 others belong to different language families. Today, of those 11, how many are alive? 3. Kalina, which is the Caribbean language, has approximately 7,500 speakers scattered across Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, and Brazil. Locona, which is an Arawakan language, has approximately 2,500 speakers across Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. Waro, which is a language isolated and unrelated to any other, has approximately 33,000 speakers across the Orinoco Delta. The other 8 have disappeared into history books with no native speaker remaining. And after they had wiped out the native language of the indigenous people that were there before all, during colonial rule, they continued to systematically target the language. Policies such as English-only laws and colonial education system punish indigenous speech. In places like the Caribbean, enslaved Africans were deliberately separated by language groups to prevent not accepted at this moment. Their native tongues, Igbo, Akan, Yoruba, were not transformed. They were suppressed into near extinction. And if we look on a global level, the truth is even more damning. In Tasmania, following British colonization, indigenous languages were completely wiped out. Not a single fluent speaker remains. In North America, residential school systems in Canada and the United States punished children for speaking their native language. And by the 20th century, hundreds of indigenous languages were either extinct or critically endangered. Mr. Speaker, if a language no longer has fluent speakers, if its story can can no longer be told in their original form. The culture has not been transformed, it has not been changed, it has been silent. And Mr. Speaker, culture is not only spoken, it is lived. It is passed down through families, kinship, and community. Colonial systems understood this and they targeted it directly. Across the colonial world, Australia, Canada, and the United States, and yes, the Caribbean, colonial governments forcibly removed Indigenous and Black children from their parents. They put them in residential schools, in mission homes, in boarding schools, in workhouses, with the explicit goal stated openly by Canadian officials responsible for the residential school system to kill the Indian in the child. The Australian government also stated was to smother the dying pillar of Aboriginal culture. And these are not made up phrases, they are exact words taken from history lessons, from history figures. And these are not isolated incidents, they were results of state policies. Now let me bring this home to the Caribbean. After emancipation, when enslaved people were finally free, the British colonial authorities were terrified of autonomous Black communities, terrified of Maroons, the escaped enslaved Africans who built their own free societies in the mountains of Jamaica, Dominica, and Suriname. So they did what colonizers always do. They went after the children. In Dominica and St. Vincent, Kalinga children were forcibly taken to colonial schools. They were beaten for speaking their own languages. They were punished for practicing their own customs. They were told that their parents were savages and that their kinship systems were sinful and that the only way to be a human was to become a Christian, an English speaker, and a colonial subject. In Jamaica, the colonial state systematically broke up Maroon communities. Children were removed to workhouses and Christian boarding schools. They were stripped of their names, their clothes, their hair, their identity, and then they were told that their families had abandoned them or that their families were dead. Think about what that means. Kinship is not only who is your mother. Kinship is the operating system of a culture. It tells you who you can marry. It tells you who inherits the land. I'm not accepted at this moment. Who raises your children if you die? Who you celebrate with? Who do you fight for? When you remove children from that system and plug them into a nuclear patriarchal Christian family model, you are not transforming a kinship system, you are deleting it and installing a foreign program in its place. And here's the cruelest irony. The colonizers said they were doing this to civilize us, to give children a better chance, but institutions where these children were placed were often sites of horrific abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, and the children were not transformed into better versions of themselves. They were traumatized into silence. They grew up unable to name their grandmothers in their own tongue, unable to sing the songs, unable to pass down anything to their own children. And do not confuse this for ancient history. These policies happened within living memory, with the last school closing recently in 1966, which was only 30 years ago. Mr. Speaker, any new beautiful new culture my opponents may celebrate are not transformation of indigenous Caribbean cultures. They are responses to erasure. They are what happened when a people has a library burnt down and learned to read the ashes. They are orphans building new homes because the old ones are burnt to the ground. Do not confuse survival with transformation. Do not confuse resilience with continuity. And do not ask me to call a fire renovation. Call it what it was, erasure. The proposition versus momentarily.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for that opening speech. We now call upon the leader of the opposition to respond. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Good day, judges, timekeepers, and members of the proposition. There is no doubt that we live in a world where cultures were suppressed, restricted, and devalued. But we also live in a world in which these cultures have continued to thrive, even under pressure, something that promotion fails to account for. I will start my speech by highlighting the inaccuracies of the motion and how it contradicts common ideas of culture. My second speaker will cover cultural diversity and agency, and my third speaker will rebut, emphasize, and reaffirm. Now, we mainly agree with the key terms. We agree that erasure is the act, process, or instance of removing, obliterating, or destroying something completely, such as text, data, memories, or history, leaving it gone or unretrievable. And we believe our definition of transformation mainly matches, which is that it's a thorough or dramatic change in form, appearance, or character, or nature or culture, which can vary. Now, I'd like to rebut some of the arguments made by the proposition. The proposition suggests that the indigenous languages have gone extinct, but areas of culture being erased does not mean that it should be viewed that way holistically. New languages have been formed and combined, seen in many creoles, which is evidence of transformation. They also mentioned that many cultures were targeted, which is true. There was an attempt to erasure, but intent does not equal outcome. We also believe that they said there was a response to erasure, which is example of transformation. Cultures changing over time as a response to erasure is exactly what we believe transformation is. Now I'd like to get into our first argument. Caribbean culture was not erased, it was reassembled. These are the words of Sidney Minst, which lead me into my first argument. Colonialism often attempted erasure, but the cultural change was survival under pressure. Colonialism was a fire, but fire doesn't erase metal, it forges it. The Caribbean did not disappear in the flames. It was reshaped. Erasure is the wrong story. Transformation is the truth. When the opposition tells us erasure is the best way to understand cultural influence, they must prove that erasure was the dominant, successful, and defining mechanism. It wasn't. Even under the colonizers' control, erasure was not the response and ultimate influence of colonization. The enslaved fought throughout enslavement to keep their lives, their dignity, and most notably, their culture. Erasure requires total cultural domination. No survival, no continuity, no resistance. Yes, colonial powers suppressed practices, but suppression does not equal erasure. People continue traditions in hidden, coded, or transformed forms. For example, slave and work songs, which we used to keep culture even through oppression and have influenced music today. Creoles, as I mentioned, where European languages forced on the Caribbean were blended and created new linguistic systems. Religious syncretism, where African spiritual systems were combined with Christianity. For example, Haitian Voodoo. Carnival, which began as a European festival, was reshaped into a distinctly Afro-Caribbean cultural expression. Again, transformation rather than erasure. And maroon communities. Runaway enslaved people preserved African governance, structures, music, and rituals, direct evidence of cultural continuity. We also see this through oral storytelling traditions. Folktales like Anna Slice survived through adaptation. We can see that resistance preserved cultural knowledge, governance structures, oral traditions, spiritual systems. Preserved knowledge was passed to the next generation, meaning continuity across time. All of these cultures have changed, many in ways that are profound and significant, but they aren't simply gone. So how can it be argued that the impacts of colonialism on culture are anything but transformation? Here we question the accuracy of the motion. We acknowledge the intent of erasure, but this motion asks of the way it actually affected culture, and it did not just make the Caribbean culture disappear. Maybe aspects of it have been lost, but culture as a whole was not just erased. Erasure is inaccurate. It was not primary, dominant, or successful. So how can we understand it as the primary influence and effect on culture? Using erasure as the main lens is only harmful, while transformation is the only framework that explains the Caribbean as it exists today. It accounts for hybridity, resistance, adaptation, and cultural innovation, all of which define the region. Our second argument opposing the motion is that the motion assumes that culture is a fixed object that can be deleted, but culture is inherently fluid and adaptive. Anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss's theory of bricolage suggests that culture is formed from the materials around a community. For example, language, religion, and rituals are shared and form into a new identity. Suggesting that culture is flexible, they suggest that culture is flexible. If humanity persists, so does culture. If humanity survives, so does culture. That is the truth. Culture is inherently adaptive. Cultural identity is not fixed, it is always in process. Erasure misunderstands culture as something that can be deleted. Culture is not static. It cannot be erased. The motion is fundamentally wrong. As I've previously mentioned some hybrid forms that emerged during colonial rule. Colonialism did create extreme pressure, bans, forced conversion, plantation systems. But under pressure, cultures don't disappear. They hybridize. African grammar plus European vocabulary makes Creole. African cosmology plus Christianity creates syncretism. African rhythms plus European instruments create new music forms, as I have stated. Therefore, we can see that the dominant mechanism was transformation, because the evidence shows new cultural forms being created rather than erased. To view it as erasure holistically contradicts historical evidence of how culture consistently shifts over time, both naturally and unnaturally. Yes, cultural erasure was the aim of enslavement, but it was most notably not successful because entire cultures have adapted and continue to be seen today. It is not accurate to view the outcome through a lens of intent. Erasure not only implies that the culture no longer exists, it completely disregards how culture works. It also removes agency from Caribbean people, which my second speaker will elaborate on. We also cannot analyze culture through a lens of erasure, as it isn't compatible with commonly understood ideas about cultural fluidity. Extensive research and evidence show us cultures change. They don't simply disappear. Cultures transformed under enslavement in the Caribbean. The culture was not erased, it has not disappeared. Parts of culture may have been erased. Languages may be lost. But culture as a whole has changed and continued transforming, and that is something we cannot deny. The opposition temporarily rests.
We thank the opposition leader for her presentation. We now go to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team Rawlins Academy, gets a chance first to ask 3 questions of the proposition team, Montego Bay High School for Girls. So Rawlins, you may ask your questions, each question limited to 10 seconds, each response limited to 45 seconds. Rawlins, you may now proceed.
If erasure is your lens, where do you place cultural creation? Where does erasure allow for hybridity?
Okay. All right, thank you for that question. You mentioned cultural creation. However, the erasure that we witnessed has been largely essentially co-opted or trying to be reduced by the recent in the 90s, the 80s, by the integration with reggae, ska, etc. However, these only happened after the erasure was so great that there was essentially a movement for Black pride, for the pride for ancestors. So, but erasure came first. It was the backbone to all the cultural creativity we see. Due to the erasure that happened, cultures raised, different forms of our culture was being erased. And these little forms that were there, we had to get it up from the ashes and try to do something with it. So to frame this as transformation, is it right? Because the backbone must have been best understood as erasure.
If culture was erased, how do you explain the continued impact of ancient religious practices such as Haitian voodoo?
All right, so these ancient religious practices such as ancient voodoo. Let me give you Haitian voodoo. Let me give another example. These many cultural practices have been largely overdone by the European practices. There are many forms of the Haitian voodoo that has been replaced and co-opted by European languages. So even though you may say that languages have not been erased, they have been. There are many forms and different cultural practices that have been erased and they are no longer here. And majority and what we have now is essentially a backbone. It's a scar. It's not the real thing. It barely has any of its original practices, values, or anything. It's essentially just a name that has been co-opted by the European ideas, such, for instance, some forms of African spirituality.
You specifically mentioned that colonizers had to continue suppressing and banning cultures. Does this not show us that the cultures had survived and it was simply an attempt rather than the outcome?
Well, it wasn't the same cultures all the time, and you said that they had to continue suppressing and banning, but that really doesn't prove anything because they banned the speaking of the African tongue, and because of that, these people had to essentially start speaking the English language. Nowadays, Creole is more similar to the English language than to the original pidgin that was there. So if this suppression and banning actually led to erasure of the real pidgin that was closer to the African language than we have now for Creole.
All right, so we thank you very much, Rawlins, for those questions. Thanks, Montego Bay High School, for those responses. Montego Bay High School, you may now ask your 3 questions of Rawlins Academy.
You mentioned that these languages have been transformed. However, the different Creoles, English-based, Dutch-based, etc., are based in the colonizers' language. They contain new words and barely any African forms. How do you account for that?
We have not completely rejected that these colonial languages do have an influence on modern Creole. However, we have argued that these languages have been transformed as, yes, while they may have Dutch, English, Spanish, or Portuguese, they also have heavy influence of West and Central African grammar and the linguistic traditions of indigenous communities.
If people were forced to abandon their original languages, religions, and traditions under the threat of punishment, how can you describe their adaptation as genuine cultural agency?
We are suggesting that the brutalization of enslaved and indigenous people did not somehow create transformation. We are suggesting that it was their bravery and resistance which created transformation. Much like how a diamond is formed under pressure, the changes in culture were a reaction. They were a brilliant attempt to survive, which was clearly successful.
All right, so last question. You say culture is adaptive. True, but how do you account for the fact that this adaptation occurred after major near eradication?
Hybrid forms occurred during colonial rule: Creole, syncretism, carnival, maroons. These forms were created under pressure. The idea that transformation only happened after colonialism is quite simply false. If transformation only existed later, these colonial era cultural forms would not exist when they do.
Furthermore, much of this transformation was not the result of the colonizer, but the result of enslaved people bringing their home cultures together, representing a new sense of community.
All right, thank you to both teams for an exciting period of cross-examination. We now continue our debate with the presentation now from the Deputy Prime Minister, who comes to us from Montego Bay High School for Girls. Hear, hear.
After 3, 1, 2, 3. It is a common saying that you cannot know where you are going if you do not know where you come from. However, when you examine colonization, colonialism, it becomes clear that entire populations are disconnected from where they came from in the first place. Chairperson, dedicators, members of the audience, and members of the opposition, good day. I stand proud with my team in the strong opposition to the motion that the influence of colonialism and culture is best understood as erasure rather than transformation. We support this motion because colonization did not simply change culture, it replaced, removed, and redefined it at its core. And one of the clearest ways we see this is through the renaming of geography. Colonialism erased cultural identity by renaming land and removing the original meanings attached to it. Before colonization, the Caribbean was home to indigenous peoples such as the Taino and Kalinago. These groups did not see land as empty space. Every land, river, and mountain carried meaning. Names were tied to history, environment, and spiritual identity. However, when European colonizers arrived, they replaced these names with their own. Islands were renamed, territories were redrawn, and entire landscapes were rebranded under European identity. While a few names survived in altered forms, like Jamaica from Jamaica, the majority of the indigenous naming systems were removed completely. For some countries, the original names of the islands have only been restored post-independence. Even so, it is only one word. What of the rest? Gone and endangered. Additionally, even in cases where original names have been restored, such as Haiti becoming Haiti, the broader indigenous naming systems for rivers, mountains, and regions remain largely unknown or unused. What survives is often symbolic rather than fully integrated into everyday knowledge. This creates a situation where cultural connection exists, but only at the surface level. People may recognize indigenous or African heritage in festivals or national identity, but they are not equipped with a deep understanding of the systems, meanings, and histories behind them. As a result, colonial identity becomes normalized as the default, while indigenous identity is treated as secondary or historical. When people can name their country but cannot name their land in a way their ancestors did, that is not transformation, that is erasure. The opposition may argue that this is still transformation, and they may say that cultures change and adapt over time, and that some may still exist today. However, this misses the point entirely. If we analyze within the lens of transformation, we could infer that these languages have been integrated and transformed. However, we don't see this. Instead, the words from indigenous languages are footnotes in history. They have been largely erased from Caribbean culture, especially their geographical input. The impact of this is very clear. When land is renamed, memories also change. People began to understand geography only through colonial language and colonial frameworks. The original meanings of places are lost or reduced to historical footnotes that many people are never taught. This creates a deeper problem. It disconnects people from indigenous identity and makes colonial naming feel natural, as if it always was there. Now, regarding language, the opposition may argue that the existence of Creole language points to transformation. However, let us analyze this more. During slavery, African and European languages met. A form of communication was invented, pidgins. Descendants of slaves born in Caribbean spoke pidgins as vernaculars, and they added more complex features and created a communication system known as Creole. But this is actually best understood as erasure rather than transformation. Currently, different Creoles are regarded as English-based, Dutch-based, French-based, etc. This means that the cultural language we now speak is rooted in the erasure of colonized people's original languages. The general grammar, phonology, vocabulary, and syntax has a backbone rooted in European systems. These Creole languages were created from erasure. Now, my second point. Colonization also erased culture through education systems that replaced indigenous and African knowledge with European frameworks. During colonial rule, education systems in the Caribbean were designed around European history, European religion, and European science. These were presented as the standard of knowledge. Meanwhile, African and indigenous systems of knowledge were excluded, ignored, or dismissed. Knowledge about African medicine, indigenous environmental practice, and spiritual systems was not institutionalized. It was not written into textbooks, and it was not formally passed on to schools. Now, the opposition may argue that the culture was not erased because elements of society today. They may point to Creole languages, bush medicines, or religious practices and say this fuels transformation. But we must ask a simple question. Where did these things survive? They did not survive in the education system. They did not survive in formal institutions. They did not survive as a recognized knowledge. They survived in homes, in communities, and often outside of official systems. This is the key difference. Transformation suggests integration within systems, a connection. What we see to instead is exclusion from systems. One form of knowledge was given authority while the other was pushed to the margins. The impact is obviously still visible today. Even in modern post-colonial societies, European knowledge is often treated as formal and credible, while indigenous and African knowledge is treated as informal or traditional. Many people learn their own cultural history outside of school rather than within it. This shows us something important. When culture is removed from what is considered legitimate knowledge, it does not simply evolve, it loses institutional power. That is not transformation, that is erasure. That is erasure. Colonialism is best understood as erasure because it did not simply influence culture, it replaced it. Through renaming geography, it removed identity from land. Through education systems, it removed knowledge from institutions. Yet some cultural elements survive, but they survive in spite of the systems, and that should not be the backbone. That should not say that transformation is the best understood way to view colonialism. Because they survived in spite of the system of erasure. Therefore, how can you frame this survival as transformation and that it should be best understood as transformation? No. They survived in spite of the system. So why should we give the system leeway? And when culture only survives outside of formal structures, what we are seeing is not transformation. We are seeing erasure. The proposition stands.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, for that contribution. We now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to do likewise. Hear, hear.
Good day, judges and proposition. As second speaker, I will show why erasure fails as a dominant lens, why transformation is historically accurate, and why the proposition framing repeats the colonizer's worldview rather than the Caribbean's lived reality. Our proposition have yet to prove that erasure is dominant, successful, and the best lens. To begin with, the proposition state that Caribbean languages are not equipped. In this way, they somewhere state that Caribbean culture today is inferior. This is completely false. Caribbean states are not unequipped. They know where they came from and they are learning it back now. However, this is not the only example of transformation. They also mention Creole and Pidgins, and that they are supposedly rooted in Creole, in colonized languages. However, when you look at the grammar and the everyday use of Creoles, they are really rooted in African languages, and the grammatical use is rooted in African culture. Furthermore, our proposition talks about school and education. Yes, culture is affected by the information you learn, but it is also influenced majority by the home, by the family, who, I state, do remember their culture and live in their culture. Culture is what people live, not what is written. Now I will move on to our first point. The Caribbean is a mosaic, not a monolith. These are the words of Hilary Beckles. Mr. Speaker, the Caribbean is not a blank canvas wiped clean by colonialism. It is a mosaic shaped by pressure, yes, but built from pieces that survived, adapted, and reformed. Erasure cannot explain a mosaic. Transformation can. The mosaic that the Caribbean region is shows us that some countries were further suppressed and suppressed in different ways. Erasure, as a concept, only allows for a dominant, constant understanding. Different colonizers imposed different cultural policies. British banned drums, Spanish enforced Catholicism, and French allowed more African retention. This means suppression was inconsistent. Different African ethnic groups brought different traditions, had distinct languages, religions, and music. This means cultural inputs varied island to island. Indigenous survival varied island to island, strong in Dominica, weaker in Barbados. Plantation systems and resistance differed. This means conditions for cultural survival were uneven. Because pressures and inputs were different, the cultural outcomes were different. Different creoles, different religions, different music, different food. This proves to us that cultural change was adaptive and varied, as my first speaker suggested, and as Strauss's theory suggests. This is not uniform erasure, as our proposition tries to tell us, because it was different across the Caribbean. An erasure is one uniform destruction, which this was not. The proposition is trying to claim that erasure is dominant and a better understanding. But how can that be a truth if it does not tell us all and reflect the centre of the Caribbean? Because the Caribbean is defined by difference, and the difference is the signature of transformation, not erasure. Transformation is the better verb. It encompasses both accuracy and variation, and does not focus on the former colonizer, but shows the agency and strength of Caribbean culture. This leads me to my next point. Erasure removes agency. It frames Caribbean people as passive, and the proposition is unintentionally making us look at the colonized through the colonizer's eyes. Colonialism attempted to suppress African and indigenous cultural practices. Keyword attempted. Attempted does not mean success. Even after the Middle Passage, a brutal experience, cultures persisted. Colonizers had to ban drums, languages, rituals, showing us how, through trauma, culture persisted. Suppression forced Caribbean people to adapt creatively, coded songs, syncretic languages, Creole languages, as my first speaker has stated. The proposition's idea positions the Caribbean as weak, passive agents that ignore the constant resistance and cultural adaptation. Erasure is not a description of Caribbean culture, it is a description of the colonial ambition. The proposition is confusing the colonizer's intention with the Caribbean's reality. This House will not allow this. To call the Caribbean culture erased is to strip the Caribbean people of the very agency that kept their culture alive. It is not historically accurate, and it is ethically wrong. Our proposition also tries to tell us that most of the transformation occurred after colonizers left. This is fundamentally wrong, because when we look at historical truths, like the creation of Creole and songs, as they have pointed to, this occurred during colonial power. Secondly, the assumption of erasure is not neutral. It is the colonizers' own belief about their power. It paints the Caribbean as a blank state and passive. That is a colonizer's fiction and not the historical truth. By accepting erasure as the dominant lens, the proposition is asking us to analyse Caribbean culture through the eyes of the oppressor, not through the lived reality of the oppressed. Representation as erasure is both wrong and immoral. This House will not allow the Caribbean to be viewed as weak, despite the strength in reality has kept their culture alive. Our proposition are telling us and denying with the word erasure the strength, resistance, and consistency and perseverance of Caribbean culture and people. Mr. Speaker, the Caribbean was never a blank slate. It was never passive. It was never culturally empty, as our proposition suggests. It was and remains a region of resistance, renovation, and remarkable cultural creativity. Erasure cannot explain this. Only transformation can. So I ask this House, will we tell the Caribbean story through the eyes of the colonizer who wanted erasure, or through the eyes of the people who survived, resisted, and transformed? The opposition proudly stands for the truth, and the truth is transformation. This House temporarily rests.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Opposition Leader. We now move to the second segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the proposition team, that's Montego Bay High School for Girls, gets a chance first to ask 3 questions of the opposition team, Rawlins Academy. Montego Bay High School, each of your question is limited to 10 seconds, and the responses are limited to 45 seconds. Montego Bay High School, you may now ask your questions.
Okay, first question. The opposition celebrates hybridity as proof of agency under pressure, but isn't it true that most colonial hybridity, like African diet hiding behind Catholic saints, was born not from free creativity, but from fear of punishment?
we are not suggesting that the culture that has transformed in the Caribbean was transformed in an environment of freedom. We are perfectly aware of the horrors of slavery. However, we are suggesting that this transformation is a result of historical suffering and shows the strength and resilience of Caribbean peoples and cultures. The fact that it has been able to survive in the face of such horror shows how this transformation has aided culture in the Caribbean.
Also, transformation isn't necessarily positive. It may have those connotations, but as I've stated in my definition, it's just a dramatic big change, which we say has happened as a response to suppression.
Okay, second question. The opportunities pressure produced transformation, but who controlled the direction of that change? Could Indigenous people freely choose to expand their own ceremonial calendars under colonial rule, or were they forced to adapt European languages, religions, and laws on pains of punishment? How is that transformation?
We acknowledge pressure as a thing, and we acknowledge that it did come from former colonizers. However, we cannot deny, as a house, that due to this pressure, not a new culture was transformed, not simply erased.
We also suggest that, yes, the direction of this pressure and the direction of change may have been influenced by the colonizer, but that does not mean the reaction to it was. The reaction to it was a prime example of resistance and empowerment.
All right. So you mentioned that culture is largely transformed and not erased. However, most of the cultural practices and religious activities that we have in the Caribbean are majorly based in European and other European values. So how do you account for that?
Whilst there are, of course, European values within Caribbean culture, this does not mean that original elements of Indigenous or African culture have been completely erased. For example, the religious practice of Haitian voodoo, which both of my speakers have mentioned, draws parallels between Catholic saints and traditional spirits, therefore showing that cultural influence has extended and that the colonized have been able to take the culture of the colonizer and transform it to fit within their own.
In trying to prove that erasure was dominant, you seem to ignore the islands where Indigenous culture survived strongly. Why?
There's not. All right, so thank you for that. We're not ignoring these islands. We're just facing the facts. Majority of these indigenous countries are not here. Majority of the indigenous people who were in the Caribbean, they're not here. Their ancestors and their descendants are not here. For example, for Jamaica, a very small percent of our population actually descends from Taínos. Do you know why? Because they were erased. So we're not ignoring, we're just facing the facts. The majority of these people, they were erased. They're not here. Their descendants, non-existent.
Second question. If culture was erased, what exactly is the Caribbean culture we see today made from?
As we said before, it says best understood as erasure. So we're framing it from that angle. Culture has not been transformed. It should not be looked to the lens mainly as transformation. We should look at it as erasure, simply put, because the culture we have today does not really identify or is similar to what these people originally had. The people from back then who came here, they didn't have the culture that we have now. We didn't have such an English language. We didn't have these European customs. So the culture we have now really should not be framed for transformation when we know that the reason why we even have it is due to erasure. Erasure is the reason why we speak English. It's the reason why we dress how we dress. So why exactly would you want to frame it as a transformation of negative or positive when really it erased entire systems of dress, it erased entire systems of language, entire systems of practices, and have essentially overdone them or overrode them with European practices. They're overridden by them, even if they're still there.
Final question. If the traditional Indigenous cultures and African cultures have been completely erased, how do you explain the increased push for historical education and cultural education about these groups?
We didn't. All right, as I said, most of them have been erased, not all. But the reason for this major historical push is because we realize that this erasure is bad. But we know we have a museum right now that focuses on the Taínos, and we didn't get these information to things being passed down. We had to dig for these. We had to go down and excavate. The reason why this was because of erasure. We realized that we know little about these people, and realized that was because of erasure. So we said, okay, we need to have a historical push post-independence. We're not going to allow the Europeans to erase us anymore. We're going to look back to our history and find a solution and actually know about these people. And even though, even with this push, these people are still not really known aside from historical footnotes. We don't really know, we know the basis of them. We don't really know what they really truly live like, as if we would know like the Greeks, because they really were erased.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm being heard now. Yes, thank you both teams for that exciting segment of cross-examination. We'll now pause for 1 minute ahead of the reply speakers, beginning with that from the opposition team, followed by the concluding speech in this debate from the proposition team. Teams, your 1 minute begins now. Just to answer the question from Rawlins, you cannot ask points of information in the reply speeches. I call upon the reply speaker from the opposition team, Team Rawlins Academy, to conclude the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Thank you. I would like to start by analysing some of the points of disagreement within this debate. Firstly, there is the idea that the death of language is cultural erasure. Whilst the death of language is a horrific tragedy as a result of colonialism, this is not the same as the complete erasure of culture. Languages can still be seen in influencing Creoles, and there are still pushes to teach these languages, and these languages still have an impact on the way the Caribbean is viewed globally. We would also like to address the removal of children from Indigenous homes and from the homes of the former enslaved. While this was, of course, a brutal human rights violation, we do not believe that this completely erased culture. Instead, it heightened the modern push to continue the historical education of these cultures. We would also like to say that a disconnection from the homeland does not mean that culture has been erased. Diaspora develops their own culture. They take influences from their homeland and they carry it with them within their minds and their view of the world. Furthermore, we would like to suggest that European languages have an influence. That does not mean that culture has been erased. Europeans spent centuries in the Caribbean and continue to visit the Caribbean today. Their languages will have an effect. That is a reality and an impact of colonialism. However, the languages of the indigenous peoples and of Central and West Africans still also have an impact, showing that culture has not been erased as it continues to bleed through in the modern linguistic makeup. We would also like to address the ideas of religion and what exactly defines culture. We do not believe that culture is the creation of a law court or an official document. We believe that culture is what people live. It is the experience of being alive. It is the family, the church, the views, and all of these institutions within the Caribbean have been defined by what people have carried with them, not what the colonizer has enforced on them. For example, religion has represented both a mixture of Christianity and traditional folk religion. We would also like to say that language is what people speak at home. It is not necessarily the language that has been enforced upon them. And the home is the center of culture. We would also like to rebuke the idea that the culture has been completely erased. Each island on the Caribbean has its own unique culture, representing its own unique history, representing the unique indigenous people which lived on these islands. By suggesting that culture has been completely erased, the proposition not only completely ignores the historical realities of different colonizers and the different ways in which the enslaved and colonized were treated, it also ignores the differences between indigenous peoples. And finally, I would like to explain why we believe that culture has not been erased. We have taken the anthropological view that culture is an extension of community, and community is defined by its experience. The experience of colonialism and enslavement was a mass tragedy which these communities experienced together, representing a new formation of culture and the transformation of cultural traditions from Central Africa, from the indigenous Caribbean, and from Western Africa into a culture formed on bravery and survival. For example, cultural practices such as singing and ways of preparing food remain within the Caribbean from Central Africa, as they were brought over by the enslaved and shared among the community, made into a culture that each enslaved person could have some hope within. We believe that suggesting that all culture has been erased makes the Caribbean seem as if it is lost to colonialism, which is simply not true. It erases hope, it erases dignity, and it erases history. Which one? Okay. Sorry, Clara's having a go at me. Erasure was not dominant. If erasure was dominant, we would see cultural uniformity. Erasure cannot explain the creation of new cultural forms during colonial rule, for example, religious cynicism. It also cannot explain the linguistic, social, and economic differences between each Caribbean state. Each Caribbean state is its own unique culture. And yes, we cannot deny that colonialism has had an impact. Colonialism will have an impact wherever it goes. But that does not mean it is a raised culture. For example, take India. Traditional cultural practices still exist. For example, the cultural practices of the Hindu religion. Yes, colonialism has, of course, influenced this nation, but that does not mean that it has been erased. Erasure suggests that the colonizer has won and that the culture of the enslaved and the indigenous has died out. Whilst we cannot deny that these cultures have been marked and scarred by colonialism, a scar is not death. A scar is a representation of the horrors which a culture have experienced. And therefore,
Thank you very much. You are unfortunately out of time. Thank you. Thank you so very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the final speaker in this debate, the third speaker, the reply speaker from Montego Bay High School for Girls, who will conclude the third place playoff match in the International Reparations Debate Competition for 2026.
For timekeeping purposes, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, adjudicators, members of the House, there is no dispute in this debate that colonialism changed culture. That is very much clear. The real question is not if change occurred, but rather what kind of change it was. Was it transformation, which suggests survival and continuity, or was it erasure, which reflects destruction and replacement? When we examine the arguments presented today, the answer to that becomes unavoidable. What colonialism produced was not continuity, but destruction. Because at its core, this debate comes down to one central clash. Did colonialism preserve and evolve existing cultures, or did it systematically destroy them and replace them with something new? It is clear that the opposition has described change, but not continuity. And without continuity, there is no transformation, only erasure. The opposition wanted to believe so badly that because new cultures exist today, transformation must have occurred. But this argument fails under one simple question. Where is the original culture that was supposedly transformed? If a language has no living speakers, it has not evolved, it has died. If children are removed from their families, culture is not passed on, it is broken. If land is renamed and its meanings erased, identity is not preserved, it is rewritten. Mr. Speaker, if knowledge is removed from institutions, it is not integrated, it is excluded. So when the opposition points to what exists today, they are not showing transformation, they are showing what came after destruction. They are pointing to the ashes and calling it evolution, while we, the proposition, are reminding you that there was a fire. Now, let me deal directly with their key arguments. They say that Caribbean culture is a blend, a Creole mixture, a mosaic, and therefore it represents transformation. But blending requires two systems to exist and interact, and that is not what happened. One system was suppressed and delegitimized, while another was imposed as dominant. What they call mixing happens when a culture is broken and people are forced to rebuild from fragments. That is not transformation, that is survival after erasure. Secondly, they argue that elements of indigenous and African culture still exist today through language, religion, and various practices. But tell me, where did these survive? Definitely not in schools, not in institutions, and most certainly not in systems of power. Transformation implies integration into the system. Instead, what we see today is an exclusion from the system. When a culture is removed from what is recognized as legitimate knowledge, it loses power and continuity. That is not transformation, that is erasure. Thirdly, they claim that colonialism led to adaptation and that cultures naturally evolved over time. Well, let us be clear. Forced change is not transformation. Transformation is organic and it happens through choice and gradual evolution. Colonialism was violent and coercive. People were punished for speaking their languages, practicing their traditions, and maintaining their identities. Mr. Speaker, a process driven by violence cannot be called transformation. It is domination, and its outcome is erasure. You mentioned uneven distribution of suppression. However, these different Caribbean islands were suppressed by different entities with different values. The English will not carry the same values as the Dutch, and so forth. Not to mention, the difference of suppression still does not deny the existence of suppression, which we have continued to say was the major force. Now, let me get back to our case. What we have proven here is erasure at every level. How people speak, how people identify, how people understand land, and how knowledge is defined. Now, we can stand here and argue that the transformation occurred. The question, however, as mentioned before, is not whether transformation existed, but which better characterizes the overall impact. And where loss is permanent and transformation is partial, erasure must outweigh. And this is where we win the debate, Mr. Speaker. Because even though the opposition can show you that something new has emerged, they cannot deny that what existed was destroyed in the process. And when the original is erased, the emergence of something new does not prove transformation, but confirms erasure. The opposition wants you to believe that because something survived, transformation must have occurred. But survival under oppression is not proof of transformation, it is evidence of resistance. What we see in the Caribbean is not a seamless evolution of culture, but a history marked by erasure, with fragments of people that fought to preserve it. Transformation requires continuity. It requires that something of the original survives and evolves. Without these, culture cannot transform, it ends. So I leave you with this. Do not confuse survival with continuity, and do not confuse resilience with transformation. Mr. Speaker, you cannot transform what no longer exists. You cannot transform a culture that no longer has the ability to reproduce itself. We did not say that transformation occurred post-independence. We said that it occurred free. We said that it occurred free from erasure post-colonization. And for that reason, this House must recognize colonialism for what it truly was, an act of cultural erasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the final speaker, the third speaker from the proposition team, Montego Bay High School, concluding this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we have quite a match to go and dissect, and we'll do just that now as the panel of adjudicators now leave to deliberate. We will return shortly with the results and the analysis to justify the result.
Now Now, I strongly withhold the stance that reparations are needed today because of the long-lasting social, economic, and psychological effects of slavery, colonialism, and systematic depression still impacting communities.
These long-term effects have created unequal access to wealth, health, education, and opportunity.
Reparations aim to address these lasting harms and promote genuine equality and justice.
My name is Shante Lawrence.
My name is Renee Shaw.
My name is Khadija Jennings.
And we're here representing
the Montego High School for Girls in the 2026 International Reparations Debate.
We are the Rawlins debate team and we want to be a part of the Reparation debate competition.
I've always loved debating, but this debate has ignited a passion in me like no other. Being a part of the research team last year was such a wonderful experience I hope to relive.
This matters because this issue is a wrong that must be made right. This competition gives us an opportunity to immerse ourselves in this cultural experience.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional / international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani, but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erickson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All criticals observe, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The burdens. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo. The history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for a more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust. in diverse classrooms. This is credible as the RUN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also
Points of information
that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring two substantive. One, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And two, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RUN Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers, and we are currently doing this now to reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And two, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And three, it protects future generations from repeating injustice itself. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the U.S. high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what will be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with...
Hi, everyone. We are back. We have had quite an intense debate amongst ourselves as judges to determine the overall winners of this match. The winners, of course, will be dubbed the third place finishers in this year's International Reparations Debate Competition. Ladies and gentlemen, the two teams, Montego High School for Girls in proposition, that's a team in Jamaica. And of course, they went up against Rawlins Academy out of the United Kingdom. The motion that they contested questioned whether or not cultural erasure or cultural transformation is what results from the process of colonialism. Which of the two represents the best lens through which to assess the impact of colonialism within the Caribbean, generally speaking? And so we begin our debate by sort of hearing a framing and some sort of characterization from Montego Bay High School as to what exactly transpired in colonialism. They speak about the denigration of the cultures, of indigenous cultures, of the original cultures of the African enslaved peoples, and ultimately the prioritization of European cultures in several spaces and in several contexts. And they say that that has resulted, by and large, in the erasure of these cultures. We get a strong pushback from Rawlins Academy. Rawlins Academy says, yes, it is true that those pressures existed at the time and that they have led to some impact on the culture, but ultimately the impact on the culture is not one of erasure, but rather transformation. Now, there is a bit of a tug of war between both teams as to, in the case of Montego Bay High School telling us that transforming of a culture and, for example, of a language necessarily requires that the language evolves but isn't forced to adopt elements of other cultures to result in the kinds of sort of languages that exist in the Caribbean, such as Creole and so forth, right? What exactly is the evolutionary, the forces that would have led to the evolution of the cultures, the original cultures? Is it a case of them sort of being suppressed and then ultimately molded into something entirely new? Or is it that the pressures and the factors at play would have led to the evolution of these cultures, moving from where they were to another culture, to another cultural expression, but ultimately it remains the same culture, just having evolved? And that is a characterization that Montego Bay High School contends would be a true reflection of what transformation looks like. Similarly, we hear from Rawlins Academy that erasure necessarily entails total erasure, complete erasure, they call it. And they say insofar as there are elements of the indigenous cultures and the African cultures still existing in the Caribbean cultural melee, that means that the original cultures have not been erased. Okay? It's worth pointing out here that we consider that there was a fundamental flaw in the interpretation of both the sort of definitions being foisted by one team upon the other and vice versa. We contend that the motion doesn't require that Montego Bay High School prove complete erasure, but that substantial enough erasure has occurred such that to view the evolution and the impact of colonialism through the lens of erasure is a better approach than to view it through transformation. And vice versa, we don't think that transformation necessarily involves taking the original culture or original language and effectively changing it over time, not imposing upon it, not forcing a radical evolution such that which results is a hybridization of other cultures. We think that that is an unreasonable interpretation from Montego Bay High School. We do agree with Rawlins Academy that the evolution of cultures as exist in the Caribbean region now does in fact reflect some manifestation of transformation, right? And we accept as well from Rawlins Academy that the transformation results through, and I think both teams concede to this, that there were elements of pressure and tension and force at play that would have resulted in the cultures as it exists now within the region. But in the final analysis, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the debate comes down to which, when you examine Caribbean societies as it is now, which of the forces are most significantly at play, and which force is a better descriptor of what obtains now. And we contend that the team that proves that their force is most meaningful and most impactful is the team that has won this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, 286 points. That's the score given to the winning team in this match. It's a high scoring match, but just behind them, 283 points, the team that unfortunately was unsuccessful in this match today. The winners of this match and the third place finishers in this year's exciting competition, the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026, ladies and gentlemen, they are a school, and that school is Montego Bay High School for Girls. Congratulations, Montego Bay High School for Girls. We think that you've won the match insofar as you've proven to us convincingly that the manifestations of erasure are more significant than the transformative effects that colonialism has had on the original cultures of the Caribbean peoples at large. So we think that even though transformation is at play, there is evidence of transformation, insofar as, for example, you've proven to us that the manifestation of Eurocentric cultures is more predominant within the Caribbean, more so than the original cultures, and that the original cultures have lost their appeal to people and have been shrouded towards the back of what is deemed to be appropriate cultures, we feel that does in fact reflect a degree of greater erasure more so than transformation. So again, congratulations, Montego Bay High School, on winning this match. And this time I will pause to allow both teams to extend kind words towards each other, and then I will announce the overall best debater.
Congratulations, you guys were absolutely amazing and we love debating you.
It was a wonderful debate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it was a good debate. Congratulations. I just want to extend that absolute congratulations, because even then, to make it to top 4 is a feat of its own. And I can tell based on your speeches and your question that you guys clearly did a lot of research. You were clearly passionate about it. So congratulations, not only for making it so far, but also it was a very close match. So I can tell that the judges also saw the passion and the research coming from your side. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you so very much. And there's just one final point I'd like to make before I announce the best debate overall. There's a particular line of argument that Montego Bay High School raised in their second speaker's presentation, which is to say that culture has been excluded from many formal spaces and now exists solely within homes and within personal spaces. Rawlins accepts that that is the case. We contend that insofar as in the vast majority of the institutions of socialization, the school and religion and so forth, the culture, which is the original forms of cultures that existed, are being shunned and are being excluded. That does in fact lead on it to an erasure more so than a sort of a transformation. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, the best debater in this match comes to us from the winning team. That speaker, the second speaker, Renee Shaw. Congratulations to Renee Shaw on being dubbed the best debater overall. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this third place playoff match in the International Reparations Debate Competition for 2026. The next time you hear from us will be at the grand finals, where we meet face to face to hear the top 2 teams face off in what is going to be a battle royale. And that takes place this Wednesday. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We will be carrying that. And of course, we hope that you will be able to join us for that explosive contest. And of course, with that, we come to an end. All the best for now. Take care.